them how everyone that comes into the world was enlightened by Christ, the life, with which light they might see their sins and Christ their Savior, who was come to save them from their sin, with which light they might see their priest that died for them, their shepherd to feed them, and their great prophet to open them. So with the light of Christ, they might see Christ always present with them, who was the author of their faith and the finisher thereof. So opening the first covenant, I showed them the types and the substance, and bringing them to Christ, the second covenant, and how they had been in the night of apostasy, might not have pronounced that properly, since the apostles' day, but now the everlasting gospel was preached again that brought life and immortality to light. And the day of the Lord was come, and Christ was come to teach his people himself, and how them might find their teacher within when they were in their labors and in their beds. And many hundreds were convinced that day, and some of them praised God and said, now we know the first step to peace. Let's hear from David.
Well, I'm glad that we're rereading this. I'm seeing something that hadn't quite grabbed my attention last time. There in the second line, to have heavenly fellowship in the Spirit. And what that says to me is that our experience of God as the living Christ, the immediate presence, isn't just an internal personal thing, just what I call the vertical dimension, but has the horizontal dimension of fellowship with others, fellowship in the Spirit. It goes beyond just a congeniality or a social group, but it is some sense of sharing that divine encounter and the celebration that we have for feeling the life and power. So I'm glad that we are more than solitary monastics. And those folks have given some good contributions in the last 2 millennia, but to have fellowship in the Spirit, remembering that it's the first really dramatic outbreak recorded in the book of Acts of outpouring of the Holy Spirit was a group encounter. It was something that caught up everyone and took them past, I would say, their assumptions of who can I understand and not, whose language do I speak, transcends all of these demographic categories that we find ourselves or others in, or we might feel comfortable in staying within those limits. But to have fellowship in the Spirit, heavenly fellowship, I'm glad it's jumping out at me today.
Thank you, David. And let's go to Bev.
I'm so glad David brought that up, because for me, it connects to other teachers at other times in other places, teaching about the connectedness, the oneness of everything in the universe over time and space. And that's the place that we eventually can get to.
Moderator's note, just please try to remember to lower your hands when you're done so that we can see if you want to speak again or not. I love the points that were brought up because of the inclusivity of God that's actually being displayed. Whereas in the contrast with man-made religion, we're always dividing into little groups and saying we're the only blessed ones and everybody else is not blessed. One. And two, we're always trying to form a unity that comes from a forced conformity instead of the unity of the spirit, which loves and respects and made in the first place all our differences and values all our differences. And even that the different, being one of those people, are meant to be a blessing to the whole. That we're not to lose our unique individuality, and we don't lose it in God, even though there's a oneness that happens and is revealed to us. We're still our unique individual, our own personality, and God loves it just like he loves all the different kinds of flowers or trees or fruits, as we were talking about earlier. You know, the unity of the spirit is formed by the spirit. It's not created by man. It's something supernatural. And when we share worship together, there's a special unity that is created there too, I think. And it doesn't mean that we all have to be the same or think the same or look the same or anything like that at all. God is blessed in the diversity, and he's inclusive to even, you know, every man on the earth, every human being that's on the earth with that of God in them, the light. And he excludes nobody and receives everyone who will come to him. And also Fox here is saying everybody can come to know him. Everyone can sense his presence with them always. And I think he's always present. He doesn't go up and down. His presence doesn't leave and come closer. Just our awareness sometimes goes up and down. Sometimes our focus goes up and down. Sometimes when we try and focus, we still can't reach awareness. But here Fox is saying, you know, everyone can know him. And that's quite a contrast. I think David has spoken in the past about the Calvinism that was and the Puritanism that was very prominent in England at this time, which said it's all up to God and you don't have a choice and you can't know him. You can't decide to come know him. You can't draw near. You're basically doomed. And you might not even know whether you are doomed or not. You know, there's nothing you can do, which is it's a fatalism that I always find myself opposing. Fatalism. Everybody's invited to God's table. He excludes no one. And that includes the worst of the worst and the lowest of the low and the poorest of the poor and the humblest of the humblest. Every gender out there, every orientation, all are invited to come and feast at the table.
when I read this section just now, I was struck by the whole paragraph in what it contains. There's so much richness there in terms of some of the essence of what Fox tried to do with people. And that first few phrases, I brought them all to the Spirit of God in themselves. How significant, how huge. So he had the ability of helping people to experience, not just listen, but experience God and Christ. Like, wow. Let's hear from David.
Well, I would be glad to hear from others who haven't had a turn yet. I see a couple of words or phrases in what we've just read that I want to raise up. And I think that Larry, who has spent an awful lot of time with these ancient writings, might help me. One is when he uses the word types. I showed them the types and the substance. And I don't know what that may have meant in the common discourse in Fox's time, or if he's coining something different. And then the other was the everlasting gospel. We may infer that we know what that means, but if there's more that underlies it and that has been spelled out elsewhere in Fox's writing, that would help me before we go on to the next section.
Thanks, David. And I see Larry's hand up. Larry, over to you.
You have to unmute, Larry.
Sorry about that. I put my hand up just because David asked. I mean, because I do know something about this. Types and substance were technical terms understood by a lot of people at the time who spent their time digging into the Bible. The idea being that the covenant with Israel in the Old Testament had all sorts of arrangements of priests and prophets and kings and so forth. And the idea was to show how each one of these things was a representation of what Christ would do when he came. And there were different explanations of that by different theologians, and Fox is saying he gave them his version of it. And so that, for instance, although the Anglican priests claimed 10% of people's income based on the tithing situation in Israel, ancient Israel, Fox's interpretation, based on some things in the Epistle to the Hebrews, was no, that is that refers to Christ, who now has command of your possessions, and it doesn't go to the to the current priesthood, which isn't even a continuation of the Israelite priesthood. It's a thing made up by men in the apostasy, meaning the time when the Christian church had fallen out of its original purity and lost track of all sorts of things. It wasn't really the kind of community that Christ had come for. That would be approximately what Fox is getting at there. Everlasting gospel is a term that he got out of a passage in Revelation where John says that he saw an angel flying in mid-heaven with an everlasting gospel to preach to all nations, tongues, and peoples, saying, "Fear God and keep his commandments, and the hour of his judgment has come." And Fox understood, even though it says everlasting gospel, and you would think that would mean the same thing at all times and places, in some early Quaker usage, it means the message about Christ that is sent into the world at a particular time, the time shown in the book of Revelation. And I think Pennington says somewhere that, oh, how does this go? He's never known of anybody but the Quakers who put out that message, fear God and keep his commandments and so forth, as the everlasting gospel. And the Quaker message is the message of God for these times, or something like that. The expression a little further on, Christ was come to teach his people himself. In the interpretation of Lewis Benson, that meant this is the explanation of the general purpose of what Christ has come for at all times and places. But it looks to me like Fox is saying that although this may be Fox's emphasis, Christ was come, he seems to be saying at this particular time, when he was making this speech, this was starting to happen, that people are turning to Christ as their inward teacher, and he himself does the teaching, and they find their teacher within. I guess that's probably all I can do to answer David's question for the moment, at least.
I think we can look at types and substance as the type is like a foreshadowing or a metaphor that points to the real thing, and the substance is the real thing. So Christ is the real thing. Whereas before we had these shadows and these metaphors that pointed to Christ, represented him in some way. Jesus was the full fulfillment of and the substance of what they were all, the prophets were talking about of old. And you can compare it with, some people think the Bible is the substance and not Jesus. And I compare it to, well, the Bible is like the plastic menu you get that has the pictures of food on it. And it looks like the food is really yummy and it's pointing and indicating what the food is going to be like. But don't eat the menu. It's poison. The real thing is the food. It's pointing at the food. So it's the shadow, it's the metaphor that points at the food. Please eat the food and not the plastic menu, because it's not good for you. Madeline?
I was touched by that last phrasing, when they were in their labors and in their beds. It just speaks to another kind of universalism, not only the universalism of the message to all of us, but the message to all of our lives, no matter what we're doing.
Yes, that constant presence, but it's also classless. So many people at this time thought if you want to meet God, you have to go to church, the church building, and participate in the church rituals. And that's how you know God. And maybe even the church sacraments. That's how you know God. Their rituals. And no, it's like you can know God, you can experience God. And some religionists have redefined knowing God to be something else. I'm not sure what. But you can experience God in your bed, when you're working in the fields or wherever you work. His presence is constant. Just our awareness goes up and down, just our focus. And there's times of worship when we put our full focus on that of God within us. And then there's time where we're at our work. And he doesn't, his presence has not abandoned us. Our focus is a bit split or divided. And we can't put as much effort and focus into it. But it's like when we both look at a beautiful sunset, we're sharing the moment together, but we're not looking at each other. It's not a direct communication. And yet somehow we're sharing the moment together. We're sharing that moment of awe and beauty, and that's, I think, how our lives can be, is that as we're going along, we're sharing it, everything that we think and feel and desire and experience with God within us. He's already experiencing it from his end, but we're consciously sharing that experience with God. And so that we're open at every moment for any comment or direction that you might want to give us, any empowerment. When our whole inner being is made one and aligned with God and his love, then everywhere we go is filled with that joy and that love. And everyone that we meet, every inclination of our heart, hopefully, can be aligned with his heart, which is infinite and inclusive and all the time and everyone. In his wisdom and his governance. And so that we can walk in joy. A phrase my uncle used when I was a little kid, trying to explain the gospel to me. It's like, the world is your garden. And everything can be approached with childlike joy when we're walking in the Spirit like that. He makes all things new. I also like the last thing is that they said this is the first step to peace. In some religious circles, coming to know and experience the inner spirit, the Christ, is somehow treated like it's the end game. Like, okay, that's it. You've done it. You've arrived. But no, this is an onward journey and relationship. This is just the first step to peace. And we actually grow in our relationship and our peace with God. Hopefully step by step and day by day, ideally. But he uses everything, And so every challenge gets transformed into an opportunity to bring more of that life and that love within us out into the world. Larry, go ahead. unmute yourself again, please?
Sorry, Ben. Yeah, just because you mentioned now we know the first step to peace. This is an expression Fox uses elsewhere where he spells out the first step to peace is to stand still in the light. The idea being pay attention to what the light of Christ is teaching you. Don't run away from it. You may not know what to do with it yet, but stick with it. Don't. And that seems to be what people are referring to when they say, now we know the first step to peace.
Any other comments on this section? Ready to move on to 181? Lynn, would you be in a position to read?
I would love to. Thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
The preacher also said privately to some of his hearers that I had broken them and overthrown them. And after, I went to a village and many people accompanied me. And as I was sitting in a house full of people and declaring the word of life unto them, I cast my eye upon an unclean woman and told her she was a witch. And I was moved in the Lord's power to speak sharply to her. And so she went out of the room. And people told me that I had discovered a great thing, for all the country looked upon her to be a witch. The Lord had given me a spirit of discerning, by which many times I saw the states and conditions of people and would try their spirits. And also at another time, there came in such a one into Swarthmore Hall in the meeting time, and I was moved to speak sharply to her and told her she was a witch also. And the people confessed to the same thing and said all the country looked upon her to be such a one also. And there came in also at another time a woman and stood a little off from me, and I cast my eye upon her. And I said she had been a harlot, for I perfectly saw the condition and life of the woman. The woman answered and said that many could tell her of her outward sins, but none could tell her of her inward. But I told her heart was not right before the Lord, and from the inward came the outward. Afterwards, this woman came to be convinced of God's truth and remained a friend. So from that village, we came up to Thomas Bewley's house near Caldbeck. But when night came, I walked out and lay out all night. And from thence, having some service there for the Lord, I passed to a market town named Wigton, where I had a meeting at the cross, and all was pretty quiet. And when I had declared the truth unto them and turned them to Christ their teacher, we passed away and had another meeting upon the borders in the Steeple House yard. Donna, I need you to turn this up because I've got move this up a bit. Thank you. Where many professors and contenders came, but the Lord's power was over all. But after the word of life was declared, some received the truth there and at the market town aforesaid.
Thank you, Lynn. Let's hear from Michelle.
I'm interested in hearing what people have to say about the perception that several of these women were perceived as witches by Fox. But the comment that I wanted to make was about the woman who said that her outward sins, many could spot, but none could tell her of her inward sins. And Fox said her heart wasn't right before the Lord. And from the inward came the outward. And this kind of triggered a thought in me about all the hatred that is spewed today that we see and in the media and what people say about others, the hatred toward gay people or the hatred toward trans people or Black people or migrants. It's just so oppressive. And I think Fox puts his finger on something obvious, that from the inward comes the outward, that inside, for the people that spew misery, there is misery inside. And in that sense, I just think it must be awful to have that much hatred inside, that you have to spout it off, at every opportunity. And it's very troublesome and leads to, all kinds of oppression and violence. And yet I think, and people say, how can anybody be so hateful? But I think they're hateful inside and it just comes out of their mouths. And I try to watch for that meanness or lack of the recognition that others are equal, and there is that of God in everyone. And so how can we malign people like that? I mean, any group of people, how can they be maligned like that? I'm not trying to other the people that are miserable. I just think maybe it can help me have some compassion that they are so miserable that they have to spew that misery. From the inward came the outward.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think we'll go to Madeline. And then I can't remember if it was Bev or Ginny who had their hands up next. But should we do in that order? Madeline, Bev, and Ginny? Is that okay? Okay.
I suspect most of the women have a comment here. That's just my guess. I don't remember Fox calling out, when he calls out men, they're usually men in authority, men who have been outwardly oppressing others. And so I'd like somebody to correct me if I'm wrong about that. Yeah, I guess that's my comment / question.
Who would like to comment on that before we go further?
Yeah, I don't know too much about that yet in my memory, but in the next chapter, spoiler alert, plug your ears if you don't want to hear this. He does call someone basically what I think he calls him what's in him speaking out is the devil. I might have that paraphrased too much, but that is one time where he definitely, you know, and he's continuously calling out men as preachers in their false religion, and he has a lot of words for them, I guess, but yeah, that might not answer fully your question, but
Okay, well, let's carry on and see what further comments we've got. Bev?
So a couple things which I've talked about before. Fox is the inheritor of the language of the Bible as misinterpreted and purposely misconstrued in order for these organizations to have power over others. So in the Aramaic, the original language of Yeshua, there is no word for sin or devil or any of these very negative and hateful ways of seeing people. We are unripe or overripe. We are wandering off the path. So there's no shame and no blame. And hatred is taught. A very young baby, even if it can differentiate, does not see one thing is bad or one thing is good. And we, at a certain age, come to see these differences in society. I'm just recalling a time when someone came to the door and I was in my mother's arms and he stuttered and I started stuttering because I found it so interesting, I think. And I felt completely shamed when my mother tried to make him feel better. So we learn very early that differences aren't held as just the way the world is. And we're so fortunate to have these differences. But as whoever you are, you have the right way and everybody else is wrong. And that's what's included in religion too. So I think Fox is an inheritor of this purposefully hurtful language to keep us separate. And I think I've said this before. I think everything we're taught in our society is to keep us away from God, to keep us away from the earth, our mother, and connected to the powers that be so that they can take and become richer and accumulate and have power instead of us all working together. So I'm going off on tangents. I just feel like it's like we have to relearn the right way our indigenous language of Aramaic, which is so much like other indigenous languages. And I'm sure others, when you've met elders, they don't have hatred for others. they have an understanding of what's going on in the world. And, you know, Fox, in talking to this one woman who was a harlot, it was done with understanding. I'm not quite sure what happens when he talks to so-called witches. I would think that that is probably more, for me, I see it as a historical thing that he's absorbed about women having power to heal, because witches were killed because they had the power to heal, and it was seen as a miracle, and they were killed for that. And I think that's probably, I don't know. I really don't know what I'm trying to say, but it all gets, for me, confusing to know what Fox is teaching at times, because he's so constricted because of the time he's in and the language that he, born into English, is like about the worst thing you could do for any spiritual growth. So I think he does amazingly well in spite of it.
Thank you, Bev. Let's go to Ginny.
Like others, I find the reference to being a witch a little jarring, because it, you know, as Bev has pointed out, that was a product of the time. However, what I find really interesting in this passage is that one of the women, at least, was convinced and changed, which is quite extraordinary. Because if somebody accused me of being a witch or not being out of right relationship with God, I would take offense. And that's the way most people react to criticism or advice. And yet there was a transformation. So what was it about Fox that he managed that transformation? He must have had a gift to see into people's hearts. And it seems to me what he said was received in the right spirit. And I'm wondering if, it reminds me of the fact that we no longer have eldering in our meetings. It was considered offensive, or maybe, I don't know why we no longer have eldering, but I guess perhaps it suggests a difference in power. But I'm wondering if sometimes, if we can see into somebody's heart that there's something amiss, if there is a loving way of reaching out to them. I don't know how, but somehow the harlot's reaction was so different from what we might expect. So there was something going on, some kind of loving reaching out, and some kind of understanding and insight. It's just my observation.
Thank you, Ginny. And let's hear from David.
Well, I'm grateful that I am always learning things from them, and it's it makes me want to learn more about Aramaic, not just as a language, but as a source into understanding that worldview that Yeshua ben Yosef would have been immersed in. And if there are those who want to point me to some good readings, I would welcome that. I've started using Sarah Rudin's very contemporary translation of the Gospels based on her knowledge of the classical languages and some richness and depth in Hebrew and Greek and passing reference to Aramaic. But this would help me. What I wanted to say is somewhat in line with other people's reflection on witchcraft or people being accused of witches, which I think under English law at that time, or during some parts of the Middle Ages and up almost to the present times, that could be a death sentence. So I think we are rightly looking askance at his telling people she was a witch. And I'm taking this as an ability to look into people's inward life, which we see in terms of the third woman mentioned. And I'm wondering whether this labeling of people as witches goes beyond healing and gifts that women may have beyond what men typically have, and go to psychic abilities, paranormal. I think that there's evidence over time that people have used paranormal abilities to bad ends. You know, you hear the word black magic or whatever, but it's, you know, witchcraft or Wicca in itself, I think is one of those earth-based religions and not necessarily harmful. But if we can get a little further into understanding what was on Fox's mind and what he wanted to do besides speaking sharply and having the person leave, that will be an ongoing matter of curiosity for me. In the Supreme Court decision a little over a year ago, what's called the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade and a half century of assumed constitutional right to abortion under certain circumstances, one of the precedents, really to my great disgust, in Alioto's opinion, was to some writings of 3 centuries or so before, in a time when witchcraft was a capital sin. So hopefully, or no, gratefully, the law has changed and we're no longer locking up or destroying the lives of people for alleged witchcraft. We have a long ways to go in understanding mental illness and treating people who are different in their behavior and their experience, perception of the world with respect and dignity. And just this last day or so in Texas, I think there were 4 police who shot a woman who killed her, who was having a mental breakdown. So there's a lot more needed to understand and to have compassion for those whose mental and psychic states are different from our own. I am glad to read this third story, that the person who had been in what's called the world's oldest profession, a prostitute, that he did not jump to condemning her, but just looked into what was going on in her, the inward from which the outward flowed. Telling her that her heart was not right before the Lord, not that she's a bad person for, having sexual relations for pay. But because of that act of regarding her with dignity as well as insight, she became convinced and remained a friend. So I'm really glad we have this story. And I'd like to think that it's a model. I don't know how many of our meetings would be as understanding with someone who was an ex-prostitute. It's, something to think about. But George has some lessons here for us. That's it.
Thank you, David. And let's go to Madeline.
Oh, unmute, Madeline, unmute.
Thanks. I have the digital edition from Friends Library, and instead of which, it uses wicked person. So I have no idea of the provenance of that particular edition, but that takes some of the sting out of this.
Go ahead then.
Were you speaking to me, Chet?
Yep, sorry, go ahead.
Well, something about eldering here. Fox's whole life is eldering, evangelizing, speaking to people, saying there is another way. He never stops. And sometimes he seems harsh, but he's trying to reach people to say, Christ is here to teach his people himself. And his whole life is devoted to that. Now, how are we to follow in his footsteps if we don't teach each other and elder? How are we to? How are there to be followers if the eldering does not continue? I don't think that, it's nice to read books, they do matter, but I think that real ministry has got to stay alive, and that means speaking through the voice of the Spirit, or the voice of the Spirit speaking through us. And we can't lay down that obligation is a heavy word, but we can't lay that down just because eldering is in bad repute and people don't like it. Because how else are we to go on? Except through bringing the presence to those who come after us. We must do this. And so eldering is kind of not a lovable word these days, but ministering remains to me a word of great power. And I think we have to cherish that word and take it onto ourselves where we are given light, to do it.
Thank you, Lynn. And let's go to Bev.
I appreciate what Lynn has said. For me, I'm not a Quaker, but I appreciate the opportunities to practice in the Quaker way together with Quakers and others. And for me, I see that the divine, I'm not sure what word to use, abun, as Yeshua used it, presents to us many opportunities to learn the way. And just as I've said before, Yeshua said, go the way that I'm going. He did not say, I am the way. And all of that came later through the church. I think he would be much more humble in saying that he has the connection, can show the way. Fox can show the way. The birds outside my window show me the way. A synchronic event shows me the way. Each of you shows me the way. And it comes through the heart, not so much the head. And in the Aramaic, there is no word for mind. There are thoughts on the heart. And everything in society separates us from that and puts us in our head. It's the only way to keep us away. So to my mind, every elder, every teacher, every rabbi is a heretic. And I'm so pleased about that. Yes, just that, we read what Fox has written, and so much comes there. So much comes to teach us in each paragraph. So I guess I just wanted to say that I'm thankful for these opportunities.
It's a real challenge being the minister, in that we're called to have God's heart in the situation. And God knows exactly what is needed for that person. And sometimes it's jarring. And so in our society, we're programmed to be very nice. Hopefully I'm not frozen. In our society, we're programmed to be very nice. And sometimes that's not what is called for. Sometimes we have to speak the truth to power, or confront people with things that are hidden. And the motive is not to harm the person or to shame the person so much, but to bring them to light. And so the greater that we're running away from the light, and the greater that we're in denial about our own darkness, sometimes the harsher the means are necessary to bring us back to the light. But the more that we are willing and embracing and willing to see the truths and admit the truth and living in the spirit, the harshness is not necessary, and it's not in the heart of God to do. He's there to restore to heal, to bring us back to wholeness. But I've been in a meeting one time, and the word coming through me is, we're a lot nicer than God. And I heard those words coming out of my mouth, and I thought, uh-oh, here comes some hard things. They're coming. Some hard times are coming. We're silly creatures that turn away from the light. We're silly creatures that resist the motions of goodness and love in our heart. We're silly creatures that think that we have enough in our own self to produce everything good in the world, and we don't need that higher power, that divine empowerment. And so lately I've been praying that I wake up not in self-sufficiency mode, but in a mode that is appreciating God and looking to his supply and his resources to meet the day. And it's been happening, so I'm thankful. I'm thankful that I am reminded every morning of the goodness of God and his infinite supply. I guess it's my connection that's going in and out. Hopefully you heard most of that.
Thanks, Chad. And over to Bev.
What Chad is speaking about reminds me of another teacher that talked about, a womb. The Great Spirit is both male, female, all aspects. That mother part, protecting their child, will speak sharply, don't touch the stove. And I think that's the part that I understand what Chad is speaking of, is it comes from a very deep place. There's the compassionate mother, father, but there's the speaking sharply to protect us, to save us. If I could just add, I just wanted to add to that it always comes from a place of love, that it's always love.
So let's do a little time check now. So we're 10 to 3. Chad's got some maps and so on to show us. We've just, this has been the last section of chapter 6. And so we've got some possibilities here. One is to end off comfortably where we are. Another option is to see the maps to introduce chapter 7. A third option is to introduce the maps and maybe try the first section of chapter 7. What are some thoughts, leanings, desires that folks have?
Just, I'll be leaving in about 5 minutes, so I won't vote.
Right.
I would prefer to leave something new to next time so that
Mhm.
everybody there will know what's happening at the same
Mhm.
time.
Yeah. Good point. I see David's on side with that. Mhm. Yeah, I think there's good merit in that, Chad. What do you think?
Yeah, and we won't reread this section this once. We won't reread it next time. We'll just start with chapter 7. If that's
Okay.
friends.
Yeah. So we certainly don't have to stop right this minute. We can just consider whether there's other reflections on what we've been reading today to share. Maybe I'll stop the screen share. There we go.
This week, as God has been teaching me or reteaching me things that I knew before, but somehow forgot. I do feel like that he's that loving parent that is watching me take baby steps. And I'm just struck with how gracious he is, in our weaknesses, in our self-doubt. He's been right there to reassure me and to cheer me on, even the small little steps. So it's been very good. It's been very positive and very affirming. Yeah, so I can speak to his intention is to lift us higher and bring us forward. If there's some things he needs to correct, he's always been very gentle in my life anyway. But I'm quite open and willing, and when we're walking in the Spirit, I think we want to see the upgrades that he gives us. We want to see if there's any way in us that is not in accord with infinite love. And so, yeah, we're much more open to receiving it, and maybe that makes all the difference. But also that when we see that there's something that's not quite right with our heart and our attitude towards people, we can bring our hearts to God for his upgrading and his transformation. It's not about us trying to wrestle our own hearts into loving people. It's about him transforming our hearts into something that is aligned with the divine heart. And so that's my practice, is that whenever I'm A, triggered by unhealed wounds, or B, I find I wasn't exactly loving towards somebody, or something quite the opposite, or I have a bad attitude towards someone, my habit is to go directly to God, that inward teacher, and receive from him, excuse my gender, but my experience of God is mostly as a he, to gain his heart, to receive his upgrade and his transformation until my heart is aligned with his heart. And it's not until my heart is in line with his heart that I can relate rightly to myself, other people in the world, different groups. But once I see his heart, once I receive it, this is a precious gift, right? It's a precious gift that we can't achieve on our own and in our own strength by willpower or whatever. If the gift that he gives us is his heart and the purity of his heart, the cleanness, the innocency of it, become like that child again, who doesn't view the world in groups and these guys are in and those guys are out, but looks at the world in wonder at anything different, because everything's kind of different. And so I'm appreciating that this week more and more.
Just a brief note, 2 weeks from today, I expect to be traveling and probably unable to join the meeting at that time.
Thanks for letting us know, Larry. Safe travels. And I see David has his hand up. David, over to you.
I'm just celebrating this phrase I'm seeing in the transcript that I just heard from Chad. And we can bring our hearts to God for his upgrading and transformation. I'm always suspicious of computer programs that claim that they're upgrading because they usually throw in a few more glitches. But to be transformed by the divine presence, the word transforming, it's even better than the English rendering repentance. Metanoia, the Greek word, turning around, changing your mind, your whole being. And this next phrase, it's not about us trying to wrestle our own heart into loving people. And I remember discovering, to my great relief, what I since decided to commit to memory. Galatians of what I came to call the big nine, the fruit of the Spirit. What are these gifts? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness. Did I skip one? And the final one, self-control. And I used to think that was an agenda, things that we were supposed to try to do. And I knew how much I would flop on those, and especially when it came to loving people. Nah, I would rather argue with them or feel better than them or be combative or even run away from them. So to know that love and forgiveness and acceptance, that these things are given to us by God's generous grace. And it's not about us trying to wrestle our own heart into loving people. Thank you for that, Chad. I can't do it on my own.
None of us.
I read something recently about coming back to our original nature, that we're born with all those things and that connection. But society and the way things are.